Chiefs of Staff. The paperback edition of that book is out on Tuesday, featuring interviews with Reince Priebus and Steve Bannon. Also with us is Eddie Glaude. He's Princeton University professor and an MSNBC contributor. And Rachel Bovard is a senior policy director at the Conservative Partnership. Chris, let me start with you. John Kelly had an off-the-record meeting with reporters yesterday. He went on the record a little bit to talk about one day in February and about what happened with Rob Porter, what he knew when. This is the departed secretary from the White House. Why does he continue to focus on this, and what did you learn yesterday from what John Kelly had to say about what he knew about the abuse allegations against that former secretary at the White House?
Well, you know, every time we think we've hit rock bottom with this White House, the bottom just falls out. I mean, it takes the word dysfunction to a whole new level of meaning. What's obvious here is that Kelly has failed at his own very, very specific definition of what the chief's job was supposed to be, which is making the West Wing function efficiently. I have no idea why he continues to go back to Rob Porter, but you know, one of the fundamental problems here is that we have a president who is not only inept at governing, but who doesn't even know what he's for and what he's against. You know, Donald Trump's remarks about gun control and about trade wars show that he's a blank slate. And, you know, the question in my mind is not why so many people are headed in droves toward the exits of this White House, but how anyone with any competence or integrity can serve an administration where the only goal is the glorification of Donald Trump. That makes it pretty tough for a White House chief of staff.
Eddie Glaude, let me have you comment on that, if you would. We saw Hope Hicks leave here. She was the communications director and a lot more, from what it sounds like, to the president, a confidant, somebody who governed whether or not people could have access to the president. In what disarray does this leave the White House, having her out of the picture? I think we've talked time and time again about, were John Kelly to leave, who would replace him? With Hope Hicks, is there a similar predicament?
I think so. I mean, in some ways, at least according to most accounts, Hope Hicks provided a kind of ballast for Donald Trump, and now he seems unmoored. And what follows from that, I mean, we've used language like unglued, and what followed from that was an announcement of a trade war. I think what's interesting beyond the circus and what's alarming beyond the circus of it all is how dangerous it is. When we think that this was perhaps a B team in the first place in terms of competence, in terms of experience, who's going to replace these folks? And this question is being asked against the backdrop of Russia, against the backdrop of North Korea, against the backdrop of the Middle East, against the backdrop of Iran. And so it has serious implications. And as for General Kelly, I actually read that off-the-record comment as somewhat of a victory lap, David. You remember just a couple of weeks ago, people were calling for his head, and the Gervanka, given the circus of the palace intrigue, as it were, the Gervanka crowd thought they had him. And so to bring it up again is in some ways to bask in a victory, it seems to me.
Rachel Bovard, I just want to ask you about conversations that you have with other Republicans in Washington, D.C. about the prospect of working for this administration. I was talking with Kayleigh McEnany there just a moment ago before break, brought up something that Senator Ben Sasse said, and she said, well, he was always a never-Trumper. That still is something that can really banish somebody from being considered in Washington, D.C. How big an issue is that still as you talk to Republicans who think about serving, think about what they might do to right the ship in the White House?
Well, I think to start with, one of the comments that was made earlier about questioning the integrity of people that are working for Donald Trump is completely inappropriate. I think there are thousands of people in this administration that are serving because they believe in this country and they want to serve this country. And I think many Republicans feel that way. You know, to be honest, this whole chaos and personnel in the West Wing, most Americans don't care about that. I think most Americans care about, you know, if President Trump is going to fix the immigration system like he promised. What are the status of their Second Amendment rights? How much in taxes are they going to pay this year? I think this is what people are focused on. They care less about Hope. Many of them don't even know who Hope Hicks is, much less care about who's going to replace
Rachel,
her.
I'll take your point there. You bring up immigration, you bring up gun control. Let's go just back to the meetings that the president has opened to the public that have been broadcast on television. Him talking about gun control, they're talking about immigration, talking about these tariffs this week. I think many Americans would find them confusing when you look at what's being said and what's being done in the way this president changes his message.
Well, welcome to Washington. The sausage making is never as attractive as everyone likes to think it is. I will say that President Trump has been far more transparent, I think, in his negotiating style than a lot of presidents have been previously. And the result is, yes, you hear ideas being traded across the table. You see fluctuating messages. That's how negotiations work in Washington, D.C. And I think Trump is trying to make that process a little more transparent.
Yeah, I'm going to get back to Chris and Eddie here in just a moment. But I lived in Washington, and the whole point of the sausage making is that when you're talking about the president, you're not seeing that. What he says is important. It carries credence. The sausage making is happening, but that's irrelevant. It's the president's word that's so important.
It's true, and I think that's why you've seen him keep a lot of his promises. I mean, look, this whole thing about the trade war that's supposedly being initiated, this, and that it was a result of President Trump's mood. I mean, this is something that he promised on the campaign trail. I'm not really sure why anyone is surprised. He said he was going to pull us out of TPP. He did that. He said he's going to repeal regulations. He did that. He said, I'm going to make America great again with more tariffs, and he's done that. This isn't something that's just the result of wandering around the White House and waking up one day and going to impose tariffs. This is something he promised on the campaign trail. His word still matters,
Whipple,
and he's
that is the way in
it.
which this happened. From all the reporting I've read, that is the way that these tariffs came about.
I think most Americans care about the fact that this is a White House that's been broken from day one, a White House that can't do anything right. It can't issue executive orders that are enforceable. It can't pass legislation. It can't keep anybody on the same page. It can't prioritize the president's agenda. Nobody has any idea what that agenda is. This is a broken White House that continues to spiral out of control. And I think that if I were a Trump supporter, I'd be furious about the fact that, as I said early in my book tour, if you oppose everything Donald Trump stands for, this is the White House staff for you.
Eddie Glaude, chime in here if you would. From what we've seen here, you can talk about trade, talk about immigration, talk about gun policy. How do you distill that into policy? Chris, they're talking about the agenda, how difficult it is to define or divine what that agenda is. How do they make progress on doing that?
Well, let me just say this really quickly, David. It just seems to me we need to understand that the chaos of the White House, the disturbing behavior of the President of the United States doesn't stand alone. They don't stand alone. We just heard in some ways someone normalize the chaos, someone who actually thinks that what is coming out of the White House is a good thing. And I actually don't know how this ship is going to be righted. What I do know is this, is that beneath the fog of Trump's behavior, underneath the mess that is the White House, there is an agenda that's being pursued, and that agenda has something to do with taxes. That agenda has something to do with deregulation that will impact the environment, that will impact workers. That agenda has something to do with literally transferring more wealth from those who work hard to those who don't work hard, who have wealth, as it were. And so I want to be very, very clear that if we focus on the P.T. Barnum of politics, that is Donald Trump, and the circus that is his White House, we lose sight of the agenda that some people are really excited about. And we just heard that just a few seconds ago.
Rachel, I want you to respond to that. I mean, a lot has been happening at the agency level. Do you think there is a P.T. Barnum element to this, that we're distracted on all of this interpersonal business and a lot is happening? If so, how deliberate is that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a deliberate thing. I think the press has sort of blown up what is normal sort of turnover in the West Wing. These jobs are incredibly high pressure, and people don't last in a lot of them. And I think what's been going on in the agencies is deliberate. This is an agenda that's being implemented. President Trump said he's going to do these things. He's directed his agency heads to do them. Where a lot of the dysfunction comes in D.C., I think, is at the congressional level. Congress hasn't been able to get anything done. They couldn't get Obamacare repeal across the finish line despite campaigning on it for 10 years. So I think, to the extent that promises haven't been kept, you need to go beyond 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and really focus on the Congress.
We got to leave it there just because of time.
The buck stops with the President of the United States. The buck stops with the President of the United States. This is the most dysfunctional, least accomplished White House in modern history, and that's just the reality.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. Chris Whipple there, Eddie Glaude, and Rachel Bovard, thanks very much for your time as well. And we'll be right back.
You wouldn't accept an incomplete job from anyone else. So why accept it from your allergy pills? Most pills don't finish the job because they don't relieve nasal congestion.